Hi. Polybrute 12 is Arturia's new flagship synth and improves on the original in two significant ways. It has 12 analog voices instead of 6, and perhaps more interestingly, it has a keybed that is their own design of full polyphonic motion tracking across every key's range of motion. It rethinks how envelopes relate to how you play its keys in ways that simplify programming expression and can have substantial impact on synthesis and performance. I already covered the original Polybrute in depth when it was first launched. I rewatched that video and it covers everything except firmware updates released after it pretty nicely. So in this video I'll focus on what's new in Polybrute 12. I'll also discuss pros and cons, both for the synth as a whole and for the keybed in comparison to other expressive controllers and synths on the market. And at the end of this video I'll play you a few of its presets that I think work well with expressive control. Before I start, a quick disclosure, Arturia sent me Polybrute 12. Other than that, no money changed hands, they have no say over the content of this video, and don't get to see it before it's published. Okay, before I dive into what makes the keybed so special, just a brief overview. Polybrute 12 now has 12 analog voices as opposed to just 6 on the original. These voices take up more physical space inside, so the synth is bigger and heavier. The voices are now stacked in 2 rows on the inside, so the synth is about 5 centimeters or 2 inches taller than the original Polybrute, and about 6 centimeters or 2.5 inches deeper. The grill on the back is where heat dissipates, there's no fan noise, and it's totally quiet. It's also about 3 kilos or 7 pounds heavier, and like the original Polybrute, it's built like a tank. 12 voices means more than 6-note chords, but also less voice stealing when playing sounds with long release times. More notes, especially when playing splits and layers. And of course, when playing in unison, 12 voices are more than 6. This also gives you more voices for the stereo mode that was added in a firmware update. In terms of what an actual voice contains, the analog structure is identical to Polybrute 6. The synth voices have 2 oscillators and a sub-oscillator, a wave folder called MAnalyzer, various sync and FM cross mods, a noise generator, and as per Polybrute 6, of course, 2 filters per voice, a 12 dB per octave Steiner filter and a 24 dB per octave ladder filter with distortion, and these 2 filters can be routed in series or in parallel and in stereo. And then on the digital side, it also has the same effects and modulation options, 3 LFOs, 3 envelopes, a motion recorder, an arpeggiator, sequencer, and matrix ARP, and 3 effects slots, including new distortions that were added in a firmware update. The only exception on the modulation side is that Polybrute 12 has new expression-based envelope modes, which I'll cover later in this video. Connectivity is identical as well, with a headphone output in the front, 2 1/4-inch stereo outputs unbalanced unfortunately, analog sync in and out, 3 pedal inputs, MIDI in, out and through, and USB for both MIDI and connectivity with the Polybrute Connect app, which lets you sync presets back and forth, as well as gives you the full state of every parameter on the synth, including the mod matrix, various preset settings, global settings, and the position of every parameter, which is extremely useful when using the exceptional morph feature, also available on Polybrute 6. Like the original Polybrute 6, it also has the 3-dimensional morphe, or morphe, and the ribbon controller across 2.5 octaves. And just the panel in general, by the way, except the color, is identical to the 6-voice Polybrute, except for this new aftertouch box. Speaking of which, let's dive in and talk about the new keybed in Polybrute 12 and how it impacts synthesis and performance. So the main thing that's unique about this keybed is that unlike any other keybed that I'm aware of except Osmos, it can start tracking pressure from the very top of the keyboard motion with very good precision, essentially making your fingers either envelopes or LFOs, and it can track each finger individually, polyphonically. Its envelopes have also been modified to accommodate for this, so you can differentiate between quick hits to the keys, which can create plucky sounds, and gradual presses where the sounds evolve based on how quickly you press a key. You can create long attacks just by digging in slowly and control the timbre of each note individually throughout its life cycle. Now let me explain why this is a big deal with an init preset. In the beginning, synth keybeds were simple on-off switches. Once you'd press a key, the envelopes and LFOs could start doing their thing and modulate levels or timbre. So you could set a slow attack, and the sound would start slowly, or set a long release. But this had nothing to do with how you press the key. Then some keybeds came with velocity detection. Still an on-off switch, just with the detection of basically how hard or lightly you press it. But still, once you've pressed the key, you've lost control of the sound as far as this key and finger are concerned. Your only option to have the sound evolve would be to point envelopes and LFOs to various parameters. For example, here, an envelope to the filter. But then again, other than velocity, you had no control over how the sound evolves. Then came Aftertouch, first mono Aftertouch, and then you'd take Aftertouch as a mod source and assign it to your destination of choice, make the connection in the matrix and add a bit of depth, and you could now use the bottom portion of the key's motion as a mod source, and you could regain some control over how that sound evolves. For years, many keybeds had a single sensor for the entire keybed, so regardless of which key you pressed, Aftertouch would apply to all the notes that were held at the time. And recently, we're starting to see keybeds with polyphonic Aftertouch, where you can play multiple keys and then control their timbre separately on a per key basis without impacting the other keys. Alongside these trends, some manufacturers have been creating non-black and white key-based controllers and synths in an attempt to give performers more dynamic and expressive control over how the sounds they play evolve over time. These include the Haken Continuum, Roger Lin's Linstrument, Rolly's Seaboard, recently Ableton with Push 3. These are all great. The problem with them is that regular keyboard skills aren't directly transferable to them. Then recently Expressive came out with Osmos, with black and white keys, so for the most part, keyboard skills are directly transferable. However, the feel of Osmos's keys is harder than synth action and a bit squishy in a way that takes some practice and getting used to. Now Arturia have come in with this FullTouch keybed, which had you not told me, I would have assumed it's just a regular keybed with Aftertouch. It behaves like a normal keybed in mono or poly modes, but when you put it in alternative mode, you get to choose one of these three modes, all of which respond to motion across the keys range using a different sensor per key, and we'll talk about these different modes in a bit. About 2/3 of the way down, each key reaches a spring to give you physical feedback that you've reached the point where Aftertouch can potentially kick in, depending on how you set up the patch. And then you need to apply more force to get beyond this initial point to move the key all the way down. Another thing that's different in the three alternate modes is that the envelopes are triggered immediately. So notice as I just press a little bit, these lights light up, which means the envelopes are on their way. You can rest your fingers on the keys, but do it very lightly, just apply a little pressure, and the envelopes go off, which isn't the case in one of these two modes, where you sort of need to reach almost the spring, almost the resting point to trigger the envelopes. So let's talk about these three modes. The simplest one is FullTouch AT or FullTouch Aftertouch. This means that the envelopes behave just as normal envelopes do. The only difference is, aside from them being triggered immediately as you press the key down a little bit, is that the aftertouch applies across the entire span of the key as opposed to just the bottom third. So all of this is aftertouch depending on how you set it up. The sustain envelope is immediate here. So we're hearing the patch at full volume, and as I press lightly, you can see the cutoff start to go up. And I have full control over cutoff across the entire range. The next FullTouch mode is Aftertouch and Z. Here too, Aftertouch kicks in immediately as you press a key, but as you reach the resting point, the Z parameter starts to kick in as well. So Aftertouch still works in the bottom third, but now we've got Z, which is a mod source here on the matrix, also available to point to another destination. So let's, for example, go ahead and point Z, let's make it extreme, to the pitch, to global pitch. Let's go an octave up. Why not? So now as I hit the spring or resting point and start pressing down, pitch will go up an octave, as well as aftertouch a bit. So now we have two zones across the travel of the key. This, by the way, is a bit different from Osmos. On Osmos, the first 2/3 represent the entire motion of aftertouch, and then the second third is the slide parameter. Here you can hear that the filter continues to open up. So aftertouch works across the entire motion of the key, not just across the top 2/3. I think it would be nice if they added an Osmos mode here where you'd get full aftertouch as you hit the stopping point, and then only Z would change without aftertouch changing. So up until now, all that's nice, but where I think FullTouch really shines is in envelope mode, or in envelope to aftertouch mode. Let's check that out. So in the previous two modes, the expression controls generated by FullTouch were, relatively speaking, secondary to what we think, or at least I think of when designing sounds. Typically, I'll start with the amp envelope and the filter envelope, and then perhaps think of how to embellish the sound even more with aftertouch or now the Z parameter. Now you could of course point these to the VCA or filter, but that would be a bit of a waste, because if you wanted this control to replace these envelopes entirely, you've now got 10 redundant sliders on the panel. Luckily that's not the case here, because in FullTouch envelope mode, Arturia has reimagined what these sliders do. So let's maybe start with an init preset, turn all the faders down, and enter FullTouch envelope mode. So by default, the VCA envelope and the VCF envelopes are connected directly to your fingers. As I press the key down, the VCA and VCF envelopes open up, and as I lift my finger, they close down, and I've got full direct control over the envelope. Now these two behave the same way. I'm going to demo this on the filter envelope because it's a little bit easier to hear with resonance exactly what's going on. So all the faders are down, and the only difference is I now control the filter cutoff with the entire range of the key. Let's start with attack and decay because they're the easiest to understand. These are basically slew limiters or motion smootheners, which slow down the response to your key presses. If I increase attack, then motions down will be slowed down regardless of how hard I press. It'll take time for the envelope to reach that point. I can go back quickly. And if I increase decay, then it'll slow down the decay of the envelope regardless of how fast I lift my finger. Envelope sustain is a little bit more complex because it has two stages, from 0 to 50% and then from 50% to 100. From 0 to 50, it will increase the mod depth of the key's motion. So this goes up further than this. Basically a simple mod depth control. Beyond 50%, and you can see that on the graph, it also increases the sustain level. What sustain level means is there's a point where, regardless of how much I lift my finger back up, levels won't drop below the sustain level. Let's also add sustain to the VCA. So now as I go back, notice it's stuck there, regardless of how I move my finger here. So beyond a certain point, let's go to the extreme. and the filter also to the extreme. Any motion under the sustain level is ignored. And then release is the closest to regular envelope release. As you lift your finger from the key, the envelope will close down slowly based on the release time, as opposed to shutting down immediately when you lift your finger. So I hear you say, what does Velocity do? And this is where I have to hand it to Arturia for yet another innovation. They included the easiest way that I've ever seen to solve the problem of programming transient or plucky sounds on an expressive style controller and letting you expressively control with your finger whether you want a transient or not. So if velocity is all the way down, you get the regular envelope we talked about earlier, opening and closing down slowly. If you hit the key quickly, there's a limit to how plucky it gets because you can't start from the bottom and go up. It does take a bit of time, even if the attack and decay slew are all the way down. And that's where, and you'll see it on the graph, this transient portion starts. Here, if you hit the key abruptly, you'll get a quick transient envelope, but if you press it gradually, that transient is gone. So there's a point where you get that pluck, and a point where you don't, and it's nicely gradual, and the decay time determines the pluck decay. And you can hear how this changes gradually as I reduce the transient. This is me pressing as fast as I can. It's not as plucky as this. So that's full touch envelope mode. The reason it also says AT or aftertouch here is that when you get to that 2/3 point, you can also use this as an aftertouch mod source. So again, just to keep it simple, let's point aftertouch to pitch so we can hear this. So regular envelope style stuff, 2/3 of the way down, and then aftertouch kicks in this case with pitch modulation. A word about the mod envelope. While the VCA and VCF envelopes behave differently in the full touch envelope mode, the mod envelope still behaves like a delay ADSR envelope, and you can point that anywhere you want in the matrix. Now what's interesting, I think, and useful in the way that Arturia implemented this, pointing the range of motion to the default envelopes as opposed to sort of optional aftertouch or expression controls, is that as we browse through the factory presets, and if we see a preset that says full touch, then we know it's full touch enabled. And if it has this little envelope icon next to it, we know it's full touch envelope enabled. Anyway, so we can expect that this preset was designed with both pluckiness and a slow envelope in mind. But if we go through the presets and just find an old one, so this allegedly doesn't support full touch. Let's go into full touch mode. By patching into the envelopes, it still does its pad thing, but it can also be pretty plucky, depending on how you play it. A really nice way, I think, to breathe life into your or old factory presets. Let's try a few more. In this case, a plucky sound can become a pad. This one, just again, one of the old presets. Let's turn on the full touch envelope. It can still be plucky, but also a very different sound. Let's try this one, a nice slow evolving pad. And as you guessed, can be pluckified, as well as still be a pad. I can do this all day, which I actually did Okay, so that's it for how the keybed and synth work together. Beyond that, Arturia have also implemented MIDI and MPE, or MIDI polyphonic expression, if you want to control an external hardware or software MPE compatible synth. It also works with regular non-MPE synths. So let's, for beginners, make sure that MPE is turned off. To show you what this does over MIDI, try to ignore the sound. I'm going to use Show MIDI, a free and excellent app by Here at Bevan. So let's start with mono aftertouch. In this case, velocity is detected until this point where aftertouch kicks in. Normal channel pressure, monophonic channel pressure. In poly aftertouch, same deal. First velocity gets sent out, and then polyphonic pressure. So in these two modes, nothing happens during the first part of the travel of the key, the first 2/3. In the alt modes, notes are triggered immediately as you press the key just a bit. And then polyphonic aftertouch gets sent out for the entire range or length of the key motion. Unfortunately, the envelope settings don't impact MIDI, so you can't get the transient with flux. You still have to apply pressure gradually over MIDI. And the slew and release don't impact MIDI messages either. Again, at least not as of this firmware. And if you want to use the keys to send out 2 dimensions of control, you can't do that over regular MIDI, at least not as of this firmware. You'll need to be in MPE mode for that. So to send out Z or CC74 over MIDI, we'll head out to the MIDI and MPE settings and turn MPE on. In MPE mode, each key is sent on a different channel. And there's a setting here you can set up to 15 channels depending on what your synth expects to get. Anyway, in this mode, it works exactly like the Osmos does. So aftertouch goes from 0 to 127 until the resting point, and then Z kicks in as CC74 MPE slide. So here you've got sort of independent control of both parameters, Z on the bottom third, and then pressure on the top 2/3. Before we head out to the pros and cons, a few tips on pairing this with software synths or hardware synths. First, make sure that you get the MIDI MPE ranges correct in terms of channel count. Some synths, like say the Continue Mini, won't play more than a few channels. And then if you want access to both aftertouch and slide, make sure you're in aftertouch and Z mode. And then put your synth in MPE mode and figure out how it accepts expression. So for example, Pigments listens to aftertouch nicely, and then slide or Z is sent to macro 1. By the way, note the high resolution detection here and the speed of detection. I think Arturia did a really good job here in terms of the refresh rate. And then Noisy from Expressive is also not only a good sounding synth, but also works with a dual aftertouch and slide controls. It has a lot of presets optimized for that dual motion. It also, by the way, has pluck detection. That's this control over here. Okay, let's talk about pros and cons for Polybrute 12. This is a flagship synth and it's priced accordingly, and you're paying a premium for 12 analog voices. So as great as the keybed might be and the interaction between them, you need to like how it sounds, which you'll hear in the presets I'll play at the end of this video, as well as the 70 presets I played at the end of my full review video. I'll link to that below. Pros on the synth side, as far as analog synths go, it has a lot going for it. The MAnalyzer wave folder takes sounds way beyond what's considered traditional analog, and the dual filters give you a taste of both 12 dB per octave and 24 dB per octave filters with a different character for each. It's got rich stereo functionality for a very full sound, even on the analog side, and then on top of that, The effects are excellent and plentiful. Then on top of that, its innovative morph feature is an amazing way to explore synthesis, as well as, of course, the hands-on control, motion recording, and the matrix all makes it, I think, very easy and inviting to program. And of course, the FullTouch keybed, which I'll talk about its pros and cons in a bit, breathes completely new life into how this synth plays and feels, both new and old presets. That said, on the cons for the synth side are that there's only so far that analog will go. You can't get sounds you'll typically find in digital, wavetable, physical modeling, sample-based, and granular synths. There are plenty of competing synths like Iridium, Third Wave, and of course Osmos that have some or all of those features at a similar price or lower, just to name a few. So that's it on the synth side, but then Arturia had to go ahead and give it this keybed, which, forgive me for the possible hype, I think is quite a game changer. With this keybed, black and white synth keys have truly evolved from being on-off switches with some expression sugar on top in the form of aftertouch to an interface where you truly feel like you're in control of the sound throughout its life cycle. I think that the combination of the fact that this keybed plays and feels just like regular synth keys, but has full location detection across the keys range, not just the bottom, together with the various FullTouch modes, especially FullTouch envelope mode, where you've got a direct connection to the VCA and filter, or any other parameter you want, along with the simplicity of the envelope controls and how easy it is to get a bonus transient if you want, makes this keybed a true breakthrough in how synths can be programmed and performed. Now, just to be clear, it's not that there aren't other keybeds or controllers with more directions of control. So, for example, there's no per-key x-axis, left and right control for pitch bends and slides like there are on many other MPE controllers. Though you could, of course, always program the bottom portion of the motion to bend pitch or to add vibrato. So if you want to wiggle pitch, you sort of can. You just do it up and down instead of side to side. Besides not having x-axis control at all, except, of course, on the Morphe, you can't control the other two MPE dimensions independently of each other like you can, say, on L'Instrument or the Continuum, or even here on Morphe. So while you do have an aftertouch in Z mode, like in Osmos, aftertouch and Z work in the same physical direction as opposed to two different directions giving you individual control. And then before I wrap up, I have one big request for Arturia. Please make a MIDI controller version of this keybed and find a way to send FullTouch envelopes with the transient options over MIDI. Polybrute 12 is fairly expensive and it's too big to fit under my desk as the keybed that I use with my computer. And I'm sure many others, once they try this out, will want affordable and more lightweight access to this keybed. So that's it for Polybrute 12. Stay tuned for the presets, and if you like the insights in this video, there are plenty more in my ever-expanding book of electronic music ideas, tips, and tricks, available to the people who support this channel on Patreon. Hit like if this was useful, ring the YouTube bell below if you want to make sure you don't miss the next one. Thanks for watching.